Hello, and thank you for attending this training on bloodborne pathogens for corrections officers. This training is intended to comply with standard number 103 and standard number 104 of the North Dakota Correctional Facility Standards. Standard number 103 requires bloodborne pathogen training as part of your staff orientation training, and standard number 104 requires bloodborne pathogen training every 4 years. This training was produced in cooperation with the Heart of America Correctional and Treatment Center, the North Dakota Association of Counties, and the County Employers Group. Upon completion of this training video, there will be a link to a quiz regarding the material we have covered. The quiz is designed for you to demonstrate your competency on the materials covered in the course. Click that link and complete and submit the quiz. You will be prompted to enter your name and an email address. Upon successful completion of the quiz, you will receive an email at the address given confirming the completion of this course. You will also have the opportunity to print a record of your successful completion. Please retain these confirmations and give them to your facility training officer in order to maintain documentation of the course completion. There are 5 objectives that we will address with this training today. Objective 1, we will define what a bloodborne pathogen is. Objective 2, we will identify who is at risk of exposure to bloodborne pathogens. Objective 3, we will identify key aspects of a bloodborne pathogen exposure control plan. Objective 4, we will describe methods for controlling exposure to bloodborne pathogens. And finally, Objective 5, we will describe steps to take when you have been potentially exposed to a bloodborne pathogen. What is a bloodborne pathogen? A bloodborne pathogen is a microorganism that may be present in blood or in other body fluids that contain blood. These pathogens can cause disease. Diseases that are caused by bloodborne pathogens include hepatitis B, caused by the HBV virus, hepatitis C, caused by the HCV virus, and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, caused by the HIV virus. The human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, is the virus that can lead to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. HIV is of a particular concern for correction officers because people with HIV are more prevalent in jail and prison populations than in the general US population. In fact, HIV is 3 times more prevalent in a correction setting, with an estimated 1.3% of the US inmate population infected with HIV. An estimated 1.2 million Americans live with HIV. In our region of the country, this equates to roughly 7 out of every 100,000 people. Approximately 1 out of every 8 persons infected with HIV do not know they have the virus. The HIV virus attacks the body's immune system, disabling and destroying the very system meant to protect the body from infection. There is, however, some good news regarding HIV infections. In the time period of 2015 to 2019, the rate of HIV infection has decreased by nearly 10%. But while this trend in infection rate is going in the right direction, HIV will continue to be an occupational hazard in corrections for the foreseeable future. One final note about HIV: the HIV virus does not survive well outside of the human body. The virus dies or becomes weaker very quickly, meaning there is less risk of transmission when exposed to tasks such as cleaning up dried blood. We will next discuss a virus that is much more survivable outside the human body. The hepatitis B virus, or HBV, is the virus that causes hepatitis B. HBV is of particular concern for correctional officers because inmates are 2 to 6 times more likely to be infected with HBV than the general U.S. population, with an estimated 1% to 3.7% of the U.S. jail and prison population infected. As many as 2.2 million Americans are living with HBV infection, and it is estimated that 2/3 of those infected do not know they have the virus. This is because hepatitis B often presents as a silent infection, meaning that some or all of the acute signs and symptoms of the disease can be easily ignored or chalked up to another cause. These acute signs and symptoms include jaundice, fatigue, abdominal pain, loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting. As you can see, many of those symptoms can be easily mistaken for something as simple as a stomach flu or other transient minor infection. But the real danger with hepatitis B lies with its chronic symptoms: liver disease, liver cancer, and even death. Infection rates for HBV have been rising nationally in recent years. This rise is associated with the ongoing opioid and heroin epidemic. HBV infection is especially prevalent in populations that engage in IV drug usage, especially when access to clean needles is sparse and the reuse or sharing of needles is commonplace. The HBV virus is also a very hardy virus. It can live and remain virulent outside of the human body for long periods of time. For example, HBV can survive in dried blood for at least a week. This survivability characteristic presents challenges in tasks such as cleaning up dried blood and other housekeeping tasks. HBV cannot be cured, although it can be treated with antiviral medication. Fortunately, there is a safe and effective vaccine that will prevent HBV infection. Next, we will discuss the most common bloodborne infection in the United States, hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is caused by the hepatitis C virus, or HCV. It is estimated that as many as 4.7 million Americans are living with HCV, with as many as 1 out of every 3 inmates in the United States infected with the virus. The rate of inmate infection is estimated to be 20 to 30 times higher than that of the general U.S. population. Unfortunately, the rate of HCV infection is trending in the wrong direction. The CDC reports that HCV infection rates are currently 4 times higher than in 2010. Much of this increase is attributed to injection drug usage. Much like HBV, HCV is often a silent infection, with signs and symptoms similar to HBV: jaundice, fatigue, abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. The chronic symptoms are similar as well: chronic liver disease and death. Fortunately, There are safe and effective treatments called direct-acting antivirals, or DAAs, that can cure hepatitis C in almost everyone that is treated. Unlike HBV, however, there is no vaccine to prevent HCV infection. While HBV, HCV, and HIV are the most concerning bloodborne pathogens for correctional officers, there are many other microorganisms that can be present in human blood. These microorganisms can be either viruses or bacteria and are present in human blood for at least phases of their life cycles. This means they can be transmitted from human to human through contact with blood or other potentially infectious materials, otherwise known as opium. These other bloodborne pathogens cause diseases such as hepatitis D, syphilis, malaria, Ebola, and Zika, and many other diseases, some of which are very hard to pronounce and are listed on this slide. The good news about these bloodborne pathogens is twofold. Number one, most of these diseases are rare in the United States, and number two, the precautions you take to prevent transmission of HBV, HCV, and HIV are just as effective in preventing bloodborne transmission of these diseases. So, who exactly is at risk of exposure to bloodborne pathogens? That is a pretty simple question to answer. Any worker that may be potentially exposed to blood or other potentially infectious materials is at risk. Examples of other potentially infectious materials, or opium, include any type of human body fluids, including semen, vaginal secretions, saliva, amniotic fluid, and many others listed on the slide in front of you. The key to remember is that all body fluids, even if you don't know what it is, and especially if there's visible blood in it, need to be treated as potentially infectious. Workers in a correctional setting that are at a particularly high risk of exposure to bloodborne pathogens include those workers that may be exposed to needle sticks or cuts from sharp objects, including razor blades from shaving, splashes or punctures that occur when helping to draw blood or assisting with diabetes testing or medication administration, workers at risk from assault, either responding to them or being the victim of them, being bitten or cut or stabbed with a sharp object is of particular concern, as well as contact with someone else's blood to your eyes, nose, or mouth, or getting blood or opium on your skin, especially if your skin is broken, such as having chapped and cracked fingers or scabbed over cuts or wounds. So far, we have detailed what bloodborne pathogens are and who is at risk. Now we will talk about the really important stuff, how to prevent you becoming infected while on the job. It all starts with your facility's exposure control plan. Your facility has a written exposure control plan that you should read and be familiar with. The plan will outline how exactly you should deal with particular incidents, how to determine your exposure risk, and how to report any potential incidents. This plan is reviewed and updated regularly and is accessible to all employees. Ask your supervisor for more information. When we talk about preventing any type of injury, including infection by bloodborne pathogens, it is helpful to think in terms of controls. The level of control that we can implement will determine how effective that control is in preventing transmission. Some of the most effective controls utilize engineering to eliminate the risk. An example of this is the use of vanishing point needle systems and self-capping needles. Remember, exposure to needle sticks, most often when assisting or supervising diabetes monitoring or treatment, is a very high-risk activity for workers in a corrections environment. When we use a tool that reduces the risk of a needle stick, your risk of exposure is decreased substantially. Other effective controls include the use of administrative controls. Administrative controls are the policies, procedures, SOPs, and work practices we use to prevent potential exposure. Examples of effective administrative controls include the appropriate disposal of regulated waste and sharps in authorized containers, good housekeeping practices that detail how blood and open cleanup should be conducted, proper laundry procedures that ensure any blood or opium in laundered items are rendered harmless, and effective labeling of hazardous materials. The least effective control, but one that plays an important role in keeping you safe, is the use of proper PPE. The most effective control is to ensure that you are immune to a potential hazard. You have access to that control specifically when we talk about hepatitis B. There is a vaccine that will protect you against HBV infection. It is safe and very effective. You have been offered this vaccine at the time you were hired into your facility. Hopefully, you have been vaccinated. If you have declined vaccination, that is, of course, your choice. Your facility cannot force this vaccination on you. But it is never too late to get vaccinated. Your facility should be tracking which employees have declined the vaccination and should reoffer it to you periodically. Additionally, if you do change your mind, you can always ask for the vaccination, and it will be given to you at no cost. Remember, vaccination against HBV is the single most effective way at preventing contracting hepatitis B. The role of PPE in preventing exposure to bloodborne pathogens is to put a barrier between you and the blood or the opium. Examples include gloves, masks, gowns, face shields, safety glasses, and even CPR pocket masks. Even the proper wear of your uniform can be considered PPE. For example, a long sleeve shirt can help prevent blood contact with the skin on your arms. It is essential that PPE be selected based on the task that you are trying to do. Very simply, the more risk of exposure, the more PPE you should be wearing, and that PPE should be effective at mitigating the hazard. When dealing with blood or opium, the minimum PPE should always include latex or nitrile gloves. Also, all exposed skin should be covered. This can be accomplished with your uniform or the use of gowns or smocks to prevent uniform contamination. If a splash hazard, or a spitting hazard for that matter, exists, then eye and face protection in the form of safety glasses and a face shield or goggles should be included in the PPE requirement. If a needle stick or puncture or cut hazard exists, perhaps, for example, in a property search situation or a shaving razor exchange, then cut and puncture resistant gloves should be used. The goal is to properly identify the hazard based on the task, then select and wear the best PPE you can to mitigate the risk. Each year, the County Employers Group at the North Dakota Association of Counties investigates dozens of potential bloodborne pathogen exposures to corrections officers. While each incident has a unique set of circumstances, there are often many similarities between them. Some of the most serious potential exposures involve needle stick or sharp injuries. Frequently, we see these type of injuries when workers attempt to recap or dispose of a used needle. In order to prevent these types of injuries, workers should never, ever, ever attempt to recap a needle. It's just not a good idea. Additionally, if available to you, workers should always use vanishing point or self-capping needles when appropriate, and if recapping is necessary, use a recapping device that keeps your fingers and hands out of harm's way. Additionally, and when possible, inmates should dispose of needles and other sharps into appropriate containers. The passing hand to hand of used sharps and needles must be avoided. If necessary for accountability reasons, the needle or sharp should be placed on a solid surface by the inmate and then picked up by the worker. Another frequent type of serious incident occurs when corrections workers are conducting pat-downs and property or cell searches. Workers frequently come in contact with sharps or used needles, or even homemade tattooing devices. One of the most effective controls to prevent these types of exposures is the work practice of never putting your hands in somewhere you can't see. That is easier said than done in some circumstances, but every worker should remain mindful of looking first and then using their hands. Another way to protect yourself in these situations is to wear cut and puncture resistant gloves. These gloves can prevent that stick from the needle you don't see. Unfortunately, the materials used to make these protective gloves leave something to be desired as far as manual dexterity and finger sensitivity goes. They may not be appropriate for pat downs, but should be considered for property and cell searches. As always, choose the level of PPE most appropriate and safest for you based on the task you are performing. The most frequent type of potential exposure the County Employers Group encounters are those incidents arising from staff assaults, cell extractions, and other altercations. While these incidents unfortunately happen all too frequently, the good news is that most of these potential bloodborne pathogen exposures are relatively low risk. Few of these incidents result in blood or open exposure to the eyes, nose, or mouth of the worker or to broken skin. But the potential is there, and you must remain diligent in preventing high-risk exposures. Some of the most effective means of reducing worker risk of exposure is to have a plan on how to deal with potentially violent incidents. Specific cell entry protocols that outline PPE requirements are very effective at reducing exposure. Similarly, good work practices such as comprehensive shift briefings, log entries, and handoff briefings about potential risks, such as identifying agitated inmates or known spitters, can increase the effectiveness of your facility's exposure control plan. Ultimately, it comes down to being prepared for these incidents to happen. Knowing where to locate and quickly don PPE can make a difference in preventing potential exposures. The use of a face shield can prevent many of these incidents, as well as something as simple as wearing long sleeve shirts. As always, select your PPE based on the task and its effectiveness at mitigating a hazard. Unfortunately, no matter how effective your facility's exposure control plan is, or how diligent you are in preventing exposure to blood or open, it is likely that you will have an exposure incident in your career in corrections. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health estimates that 1 out of every 3 corrections workers will have a potential exposure to bloodborne pathogens in the course of their career, and 1 out of every 4 of those workers will have multiple incidents. When and if that potential exposure happens, there are some steps you can take immediately to limit the potential of that exposure. Always wash the exposed area with lots of soap and water. If the exposure was to your mouth, nose, or eyes, flush them with lots of water and irrigate your eyes with water and saline. The goal is to get the blood or opium off and out as quickly and as effectively as possible. Make sure you report any exposure as soon as possible to a supervisor. They will help guide you through the documentation reporting on the incident and ensure that you receive the appropriate medical treatment. When to seek medical treatment for a potential bloodborne pathogen exposure can sometimes be a difficult decision for corrections workers. What is a high-risk exposure and what is a low-risk exposure? Here are some basic guidelines to assist you in making the decision on whether to seek medical treatment. Always seek treatment for needle stick or sharp injuries. Needle sticks represent the highest rate of infection potential. Depending upon several factors, including the type of pathogen, the depth of stick, the gauge of the needle, etc., some needle stick injuries demonstrate rates of infection as high as 30%. Workers should also always seek medical treatment if blood or opium makes contact with the eyes, nose, mouth, or broken skin. Blood exposure to open wounds and or the mucous membranes are high-risk exposures and require medical evaluation. Lower risk exposures include blood or opium on clothing or PPE. Of course, these exposures should be documented and cleaned up promptly, but the likelihood of pathogen transmission is low in these instances. In the end, it is always better to be safe than sorry. If you, as the exposed worker, have any doubt on whether or not to seek medical evaluation or treatment, err on the side of caution and go promptly to your designated medical provider or emergency department. In North Dakota, and as members of the county employers group, it is your right to seek medical treatment and file a workers' compensation claim for any potential workplace injury or illness. Finally, if you do seek medical treatment or evaluation, there is some information that your medical provider will need in order to accurately assess the potential risk of bloodborne pathogen transmission and to be able to provide you with the appropriate level of treatment. Be prepared to share with your provider the following information: the date and time of the exposure, details of how the exposure occurred, including whether or not it involved sharps or a needle stick, the amount of blood or opium exposed to, the gauge of needle or size of the sharp, if appropriate, the wound depth, if appropriate, the duration of the contact, and the condition of your skin in the exposed area at the time of the incident. It is also helpful to know details about the source of the blood or opium, specifically whether or not the source is infected with a bloodborne pathogen. These details may not be readily available due to healthcare privacy issues. It is important information that may require source testing. Your facility exposure control plan will outline for you how your facility plans to obtain this information. It is also important to be able to share your vaccination information. A high-risk exposure to HBV is a much lower risk to a vaccinated worker than an unvaccinated worker. This now concludes your training on bloodborne pathogens for correctional officers. On the bottom of this webpage is a link to a quiz. The quiz is designed for you to demonstrate your competency on the materials covered in the course. Click that link to complete and submit the quiz. You will be prompted to enter your name and an email address. Upon successful completion of the quiz, you will receive an email at the address given, confirming the completion of this course. You will also have the opportunity to print a record of your successful completion. Please retain these confirmations and give them to your facility training officer in order to maintain documentation of the course completion. Thank you for attending this training course. As always,